okay, right away, here I am, first time in the building, and there's somebody. And that ended up becoming a really interesting experience because when we went in and did the first investigation after that, we were down in the pool room, and I was recording with a gentleman named Matt, and we were down there, and I had the EVP, and I'm also sensitive, and it's something that I'm still kind of learning to embrace. But when I was down there, this name came into my head, and I was kind of hearing two names. I was hearing Bobby or Robert, which of course is the same name, but right. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I started asking who's Robert or Bobby. And then later that same evening, all the teams were, the team was broken up into small groups and everybody was rotating through the rooms. So at the end of the evening, we were in the main living room and we were doing a spirit box session, and we had cameras and, all the equipment set up pointing at us. And I was asking during the spirit box session, and I said, Robert or Bobby, what'd you lose? And one of our other sensitives, who was on a different group than mine, kind of gasped, and she went, I got the same name. And I asked her, Of course, where'd you get it? And she said, down in the pool room. And I was like, oh, wow, holy crap, right? So that was cool. And then during the spirit box session, I actually asked Robert or Bobby. I always use the same names because I didn't know which he prefers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I was Robert or Bobby, what's your favorite room? And everybody in the room, we got it on the EVP on the recorders. You could hear very clearly through the spirit box this response that came back and said pool room. So we're like, wow. Okay, that's awesome. What was even more interesting was we found out later, I was talking with one of the board members about maybe a month and a half later, and I hadn't had a chance to sit down and go over the evidence with him that we had gathered at that time. But I was sitting with him and I was telling him about our experiences, and I told him about this encounter with Robert or Bobby. And he's a skeptic, right? He's kind of a skeptic. He's one of those who doesn't necessarily believe that there are spirits in the building. But he looks at me and says, oh, you just gave me goosebumps. And I'm like, okay, well, why is that? What happened? What do you mean? And he said, well, two of our founders were named Robert, right? There were two Bobbies that worked there.
Oh, my God.
One of whom is deceased and one of whom was in hospice last they had heard and may or may not have passed since. But that was fascinating because he actually went down and showed me this plaque. Apparently there was a plaque with their names, or not a plaque, I'm sorry. It was in the bricks. Some of the bricks have names carved into them of the founders. And I hadn't really ever looked at those specifically. So he took me out and he showed me this brick with their names in it. And there's two different Roberts attached that were founders. And so it was really a fascinating set of occurrences, the way it all came together, because, in my research, I'd never come across that name. Robert or Bobby were not names I'd ever heard. So it was really kind of an amazing moment, I think, for all of us, because it was this validation. And even later in our ghost hunt, when we did the ghost tour in October, we were down in that same pool room. And we were taking photos in the dark with the IR cameras and everything. And we had several guests who had bought tickets to come take the tour, and they were down there with us. And I was looking through my IR camera, getting ready to take some video, and I saw this shadow move across the pool room, and it stopped right next to one of the guests that was there. And what was interesting is before I even really said anything, he goes, I just saw a shadow and it stopped right here next to me.
Whoa.
So, it's interesting because I'm at this point convinced that there is the spirit of Bobby in the building. And, he kind of hangs out in the pool room down there, which is also near what used to be the kitchen. There's a section off where it used to be the kitchen. And so I think he kind of hangs out down there, but he's a good example because the spirits attached to the building don't really present themselves often. And when they do, it's pretty brief. So, but that's not to say there haven't been some pretty interesting stories as well about kind of bigger encounters. So there's really a lot of interesting evidence that we've been able to gather. So it's been quite a journey going in there all these times.
Hey, Zach, let me ask you, have you found any visual evidence?
Great question. We haven't really gotten a ton of visual evidence. We did have a photo in one window that seems like it may or may not show the figure of a man kind of reflected in the glass. And of course, the windows are looking out. We've kind of gotten mixed reactions to it. And to be honest, myself, I'm not even 100% sure. It's pretty faint. It looks like there could be a figure there in the glass in one of these photos. but it's not really clear enough that we can kind of hold it up and say this is, concrete evidence. So the visual evidence has been a little more lacking, but we've had a lot of EVPs and encounter stories from folks who've been there. In fact, one lady who is there frequently, I won't say her name because I haven't asked her for permission yet, but she had an encounter actually even in the bathroom. She was in there's a room where they play darts, and it's separate from this little short hallway where the bathrooms are. And she was in there by herself playing darts, and she heard the sink in the bathroom come on. And so she went in there, and of course no one's in there. And she said that she basically saw this sink turn on and then turn off by itself. Wow. And these are, the old turn handles that you have to physically move them. It's not
it's not a sensor.
Right, exactly.
Once again, the ghosts like to keep their hands clean.
Apparently, it's because they're attached to the hospital, I guess.
There you go.
Oh, that's great. The bricks that you were talking about, Zach, are those in the pool room?
So those are actually out on the sidewalk, and it was really I was a little bit ashamed of myself because I hadn't really noticed them before. I mean, they're when you walk up to the main building, there is this kind of brick pathway, and near the front steps, there are these old bricks that have names in them. And I mean, I noticed them, but I never really asked what they were. And so it was only after that with Bobby that we found out that those were primarily the names of founders of the press club and people who had been really attached to the development of it over the years. So you can actually see those just even outside the building. You don't even have to go inside. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is cool. It's cool that you got that kind of confirmation about the Roberts. That's an interesting story. What about, so I saw an interview that you did on Channel 4 when you were, I think it was last year, maybe. You were walking through the building, and I noticed one of the things that you did was as soon as you walked in, you greeted Mrs. M.
Yes.
Can we talk about Mrs. M? Because I know that there have been several sightings of a woman in black. I know that there's been the sound of high heels on the wood floor.
Yes.
And I think even while you guys were there with the news, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was a moment where somebody said, "I really like your house," and then the EVP picked up, "Thank you."
Yes. Yeah. That was actually from our first investigation. In fact, we had kind of loaned that over to the news crew for the article episode. But yeah, it absolutely, she is far and away the most commonly experienced presence in the building. People have talked about, hearing her walk. Real quick, I'm going to say there is an old story you'll see online as well about if you leave a shot of gin on the bar, you'll come back the next day and find it empty.
I heard that, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I don't know anybody who has ever actually seen that happen. And usually when I ask, people have said, well, all the board members have keys.
Right.
Which I just thought was funny. But no, so that one is an interesting story, but there doesn't really seem to be that one I think is an urban legend because it actually turns out she wasn't a gin drinker at all. She actually hated gin anyways. So if there was a spirit doing that back in the day, it was someone else. But her presence has definitely been felt frequently. We did in our first investigation, we were actually up in the boardroom. And Lydia was there for that one. Lydia and myself and another young lady named Anwar were in there, and we were doing some EVPs. And while I was standing in this boardroom, I felt a spirit poke me in the shoulder, very, very physically, not aggressively, just like I think it was more of a curiosity, like, what are you doing here? But it was a very real, solid physical touch on the shoulder. And I was like, oh, did you just touch me? And we did get an EVP of her saying yes. And then a few minutes later, it's interesting because when a spirit touches you, you'll feel it for quite a while afterwards. It lingers. And so we were still doing this EVP. And one of the ladies had said, "You sure have a beautiful home, Mrs. M." And she did. She responded, "Thank you," rather clearly. So that was a beautiful, beautiful piece of evidence. I think she really appreciates when people have that respect and that appreciation for her home. And if you go in there and you show that kind of affection for the home, I think you are somewhat more likely to actually hear from her because she seems to really enjoy the fact that people still find comfort there,
It almost seems like that's what tethered her to the building, was her love for it. It seems like that she wasn't even willing to part with it, in death. And so I can definitely understand why she would be responsive to that kind of reaction, because she obviously was proud of the house. She obviously cared a lot about it. And I'm sure that she resisted leaving in her old age when she was ill. I'm sure that was a tough decision for her.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine as well. Cause she very much loved the home. I mean, it shows. You can tell. Even when you walk in there now, like I say, you can still feel that. And I think it's very much what anchored her to the spot. I think she, that's what we see often in the paranormal, right? People, despite some of the misconceptions, typically when a spirit lingers somewhere, it's because they have an attachment to it that's either a deep, deep love or an affection or maybe a trauma. But it's certainly not always, as the ghost stories tell, because they died there or whatever. But yeah, I think she definitely did. I think, and she does, whenever we've gone in and we've investigated and we've kind of shown that love and that respect for the home, I think you can, this may sound a little out there, but I think you can actually develop a relationship with Cliffy in a way. I feel like if you go there often enough, you can kind of, that's why I always greet her, because I always feel like I'm walking into her home still. So I want to say hi. I want to be polite. And there's a sense of comfort there. And I think that, you can develop this sort of relationship with her where she still may not necessarily present herself as often, because I will say, I think we know where she spends most of her time in the building though. I think we've got that narrowed down, because there's one room in the building, and I'm going to ask Lydia to speak to this maybe in a moment as well. There's a room in the building where every time I take somebody in there for the first time, what we'll do is we'll have them stand in all four corners of this room, and we won't say anything. Just go stand in that corner for a minute. Now go stand in that one. And they go through all four. And then I ask them, did you notice anything? And almost without fail, they'll say, yeah, this one corner was heavier, or I felt kind of dizzy in this corner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's happened almost without fail. I mean, I've brought in visiting artists, poets, you name it. And it's almost without fail. And I don't know, Lydia, when we did that first investigation, I think we did that as well. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Do you remember your experience in that corner?
I do actually. Yeah, it was off. It was definitely off. I mean, I'm not one to feel things, but it felt definitely different. I don't know. I can't even explain it.
Right on. Yeah, thank you. I mean, absolutely, it is. It's just amazing how it happens, and it's always one of two corners. So I think we kind of get the sense that she does move around, but very clearly we think she stays in that same room most of the time, because that's where we usually get EVPs and experiences with her as well. So it's kind of like she has this room. I don't know the history of that room specifically, because over time, of course, there have been some changes and renovations, but I don't know if it was maybe a bedroom she used to sleep in, or just a room that had some kind of importance for her, or maybe it's just a good place to be able to see what's going on. But it's interesting, because even in that same room, we went out on our first investigation. We went out on the patio. There's this beautiful brick patio in the back where you can get a great view of downtown Albuquerque. And we had walked out there, and without anybody saying a word, I noticed that like 5 or 6 of us turned around and started taking photos of this same window in the building. Like we were all, it was like we were all feeling like we were being watched from this window, and it was that same room. And we found out later that there's a lot of people who said they feel like they're being watched from that same window pretty often. So There's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence, I guess, that, that room seems to be really a key spot for her. So it was just fascinating to watch all these people turn and start taking photos of a window with no communication. It was wild.
It sounds like a lot of what happens there is pretty benign in terms of the activity is not malicious or malevolent at all. It sounds like it's very peaceful. Do you think that's accurate?
I would say so. I don't know of any stories. Wait, let me think. There might be one. Trying to recall. I feel like I did hear one. really, I don't know too many stories that involve any kind of malevolent intent. I don't actually know of any that involve anything malevolent or like malicious.